Hello, Robert Graves said he had a better command of the English language than any living writer. Joseph Brodsky has called him the best poet the English language has today. He's just won the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry, an honour he shares with W.H. Auden and Philip Larkin. But Derek Walcott, who's the subject of tonight's programme, is comparatively unknown in Britain. Perhaps this is because he comes not from Britain or the United States, but from the tiny West Indian island of St. Lucia. St. Lucia is a dot on the map. It's only 27 miles long and 14 miles wide. It lies in the chain of Windward Isles that runs between the Caribbean and the Atlantic. Before it became independent 10 years ago, it changed hands between the British and French 14 times, so that it now has two languages. One is English, the other's a combination of French and West African, and that's called Creole or Patois. Derek Walcott grew up speaking English with a formidable education in English and European literature. But he came to use the forms of European literature to describe the unnamed New World, and at the heart of his work lies a number of divisions between English and the Creole, black and white, Old World and New World, home and abroad. For like many of his countrymen, Derek Walcott has spent much of his adult life away from home. He now lives in Boston, where he teaches at the university. But he spends several months of every year on St. Lucia, his island, his home, and the subject of much of his poetry.
No. Well, not on the same road.
In idle August, while the sea soft, and leaves of brown islands stick to the rim of this Caribbean, I blow out the light by the dreamless face of Maria Concepcion to ship as a seaman on this schooner flight. So I smile to myself as the bow rope untied and the flight swings seaward. There's no use repeating that the sea have more fish. I want her dressed in the sexless light of a seraph. I want those round brown eyes like a marmoset, until the day when I can lean back and laugh, those claws that tickled my back on sweating Sunday afternoons like a crab on wet sand. As I worked, watching the rotting waves come past the bow that scissor the sea like silk, I swear to all you, by my mother's milk, by the stars that shall fly from tonight's furnace, that I love them, my children, my wife, my home. I love them as poets love the poetry that kills them, as drowned sailors the sea. You ever look up from some lonely beach and see a far schooner? Well, when I write this poem, each phrase will be soaked in salt. I go draw and knot every line as tight as ropes in this rigging. In simple speech, my common language go be the wind, my pages the sails of the schooner flight. But let me tell you how this business began.
And brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called each living creature, that was the name thereof. And Adam gave names to all cattle, and to the fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found an helpmeet for him.
I remember only one thing about my father, who died when I was 1, and I think it's a hallucination. I remember a moment in my childhood in which I thought I saw him, not defined, but at the foot of the stair. That's all I remember of him. And of course, this was not real, except it may have been a memory of an infant. But growing up at home, my mother, who was a school teacher, used to perform in amateur concerts that he evidently would have directed, and his friends. And she was a great reciter. She would recite Portia's speech and other poems and stuff. And then she had friends who were also amateur actors and so on. So I grew up with the sound of my mother reciting these great speeches because she'd played Portia. And I think very young I wanted to write something that sounded, good enough for her to want to recite. Way down there.
Was this something you were actually conscious of doing at the time?
My father's absence, and she talked about him continually. I felt, both myself and my twin brother, that what I wanted to do was to continue the sort of work that he'd done. We had emblems, stuff of his around the house. We had paintings and reproductions that he'd copied of, Millets, Gleaners, and Turner's The Fighting Terror, and so on. They were, all around. And then a couple of his own original watercolors. He was a very good painter. So I just felt from very young, from 9 on, that that's what I wanted to do. I knew from that age that that's what I wanted to do.
Do you go about doing it from that age on?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I also had very encouraging teachers. They'd make me, sometimes I recited in front of the school. I'd show them my poems, and they must have been young men of about 19 or 18, but they were amazingly encouraging.
What's the capital of St. Lucia? Huh? The capital of St. Lucia. Castries or Beaufort? Huh? Yes, Castries is the capital of Lucia. It's a town or a country? It is a city, yes.
Boy, name the great harbors of the world. Sydney, sir. San Francisco. Naples, sir. And what about Castries? Sir, Castries is a coaling station and the 27th best harbor in the world. In it, the entire British Navy can be hidden. What is the motto of St. Lucia, boy? Statio haud malefida carinis. Sir, sir. And what does that mean? Sir, a safe anchorage for ships. The experience of childhood I had as a British colonial was benign, very. It was even kind in a sense. And this may sound like, comes as a shock to people who say, well, this is how he talks because he's, look at what he is now. Cliche, whatever. But I think in my generation, I think the generation of writers like Lamming and maybe Naipaul, yes, I think what we went through was, for instance, the presence of the policeman on the street was an unarmed native policeman who had to be polite to you and so on. I mean, this is the English Bobby in the tropics. This is not the same thing as, say, the French gendarme in Martinique or the Latin American cop. This man, this native constable, embodied all the whatever was supposed to be, proper, gentle, and disciplined in that empire, to the point where, as boys, we'd harass policemen and shout at them, and they never chased us. They just, that's a very ordinary symbol of things. But also in terms of the, and I think you couldn't separate, maybe I just could not separate my love of the English language from the sort of sunset, the benign beginning sunset of its empire. I'm quite aware of the brutalities. I'm quite aware of the, I'm saying in my own actual experience in St. Lucia as a young West Indian, this was not, I never felt degraded by, by colonialism. I know the facts of it. I could see what happened. My personal experience was not that.
How would you more exactly locate yourself, as it were, on the island you grew up in?
The freshness, the richness, the cool, the whole feeling of the hills and the sea and stuff up in the country and around the town too. I mean, it was something that was so very strong in me. I mean, I'd feel almost sometimes as if I'd choke from it sometimes, you know, as a child, because I just felt that I wanted to put it down a lot or to paint it. And it was a totally unnamed, totally virginal kind of landscape. So I was very excited. I mean, I had a tremendous excitement in me from very young about wanting to put that down. About the August of my 14th year, I lost myself somewhere above a valley owned by a spinster farmer, my dead father's friend. At the hill's edge, there was a scarp with bushes and boulders stuck in its side. Afternoon light ripened the valley. Rifling smoke climbed from small laborers' houses, and I dissolved into a trance. I was seized by a pity more profound than my young body could bear. I climbed with the laboring smoke. I drowned in laboring breakers of bright cloud. Then, uncontrollably, I began to weep. Inwardly, without tears, with a serene extinction of all sense. I felt compelled to kneel. I wept for nothing and for everything. I wept for the earth of the hill under my knees, for the grass, the pebbles, for the cooking smoke above the laborers' houses like a cry, for unheard avalanches of white cloud. But darker grows the valley, more and more forgetting. For their lights still shine through the hovels like litmus. The smoking lamp still slowly says its prayer. The poor still move behind their tinted scrim. The taste of water is still shared everywhere. But in that ship of night, locked in together, through which like chains a little light might leak, something still fastens us forever to the poor.
You began by being a painter, didn't you? Was that because it was easier to be an artist as a painter?
Well, I didn't quite. I tried to do both. But there's a very big difference between somebody who can paint pretty well and somebody who's a painter. And I think I think my son is a painter much more than I am. And it's a simple thing about it being in the wrist. It's something it's how the paint is moved along, you know, recklessly, you know, without any kind of caution. And although I can paint pretty competent watercolors, I just don't have that burst in confidence that one has in being, you know, somebody sloshing the paint around with a lot of, you know, I don't slosh, I just sort of pull, you know. It's all very Methodist.
You decided to become a poet at a remarkably early age, and having decided to do that, was there a sort of artist's life that you led as a young man?
Oh, well, there wasn't you know, like a giving up of a job and doing that somewhere alone or something like that. You know, one could write, and the job I had after I left college was teaching as a young assistant master in the college, which consisted of having to wear a tweed coat and a tie, you know, just if you were in London, you know, and a tin of Country Life cigarettes if you were a young assistant master and so forth. So there wasn't any sort of break from normalcy and going off and doing something. Although a friend of mine, who I wrote about in Another Life, has done that and did that, became a painter completely. So the direction was this usual one of, you know, leaving school, getting a job as a teacher, and then going off to university in Jamaica. Sometime much later, when I left university and was first married, I decided that I was definitely going to stop anything else but paint. And then I got very, very afraid because I began to actually start a canvas and thought, wait a minute, if I'm going to make a living off this thing, I have to do about 200, you know what I mean, a month, at so much a month, that didn't work out.
Okay, after you.
Wait, no, you lead because I don't. But Dunstan, you had another. This is not the same studio you had, right?
No, that's about the third or the fourth.
Along with his school friend, Dunstan St. Omar, who's since become a professional painter, Derek Walcott was taught to paint by a friend of his dead father, called Harry Simmons.
Remember when Harry's up at Barnard Hill, Harry's studio?
Yeah, man. That's our first studio. Our earliest studio.
Painting on the veranda?
Uh-huh.
Right.
What's the name of that?
Through painting with Harry Simmons, Walcott realized that he didn't need to depend on the European themes of the pictures and books he'd studied. His own landscape and his own people were also fit subjects.
That must have been the first local good portrait of a black woman I ever saw.
And with the native head tie, remember?
Right. He did a watercolor of it after for Michael Beaubrun.
I can't remember that one.
Yeah.
I can remember the oils, eh?
It's not the studio now.
Yeah, that's...
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
The harbour has changed a lot, eh?
They've still got that cliff where they're still quarrying, So
But there were the taller buildings, because they're like sort of gamboge and brick buildings with red roofs. So we used to look at...
Like the military hospital and so forth?
Say it looked like Cézanne or part of an Italian painting in the later afternoon. I think that's gone, no?
Yeah.
Or some of it is still there. More than anything, I think the main thing was that we saw, when we went up to his studio, we saw paintings of St. Lucia, watercolors of the beaches and the mountains. And then we saw paintings of people. I mean, these were black people. These were St. Lucian people.
La trèfle ouè doit dire en fond gol pour ça la force fallait en coué et puis l'entrée la rivière en bas ballon balai l'étage yo pareil la rivière cachaille descend dans celle plaisir les Koubi chabot serré à beau tiré calculé la bosse mène affligé quand pas
I remember I used to go up in the trips in the country with him, and he would stop off at different villages because he was a welfare officer, and you'd have a drink there and so on. And you got to know the country through that little kind of odyssey that you do around it, in the most beautiful and sometimes very remote places, So the paintings that he did and the development of the affection and then the love and then the confidence that seeing that kind of work gave to Dunstan and myself was a tremendous thing, because it is you cannot possibly imagine the excitement that would be there in going off into some part of St. Lucia in a place that's never been painted before and just trying to get it down. I can remember the smell of the paint if we were painting together, and the shape of, say, a breadfruit leaf, the richness of the green paint inside the outline and the smell of the oil, painting in the open if you were doing that. And to me, it was almost the same thing I was trying to get. If I wrote the word breadfruit, I was trying to get back of it. All whatever I had in my hand about what the color of the paint would be if I were using a brush rather than a pen. And to make it as as tactile and as if you could get the smell of it as well on the page, that's a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of joy.
In your verse, there are echoes of many great poets. There's a canon of English literature there. There's Wordsworth and there's T.S. Eliot and Keats and Marvell and Dylan Thomas and Edward Thomas and many others. You're working inside a tradition. Were you very conscious of doing that?
But I remember the Faber Orden and the Faber Eliot and stuff like that, and just the physical thing of holding these books and Thomas and so on. What I used to do is almost every day, or as often as I could, I had an exercise book or exercise books in which I would model a poem directly onto, almost like an overlay, down to the rhymes and the meter, but out of my own background and family and landscape and so on. I didn't feel anything. It was just to me a complete apprenticeship, a complete surrender to modeling, because I knew that I was in a landscape that didn't have pylons and and trains and autumn or whatever.
One critic, writing in the New York Times, has said of Walcott's work, "Despite his superb command of English, he has never felt quite at home in it. The paradox of a colonial identity is that it both liberates and oppresses, offering freedom from a dominating tradition, yet robbing the poet of any natural claim on the language."
Well, I think the difference lay not in the longing to see elms and oaks, really. The point was the alleged embarrassment, supposed embarrassment, the presumed disinheritance, the presumed inferiority of mangoes next to elms or palm trees next to eucalyptus or pines or something. That's the penalty that colonialism brings with it, that everything becomes less than its alleged, superior, its alleged original. And that's the sort of distinction I was trying to make in terms of not wishing that the climate were different, but beginning to realize, and it's a very simple answer, it is simply that those things are named by the literature. Somebody in Warwickshire who says elm, right, says elm. But if Shakespeare says elm, then that's a noble tree. The difference simply is that there was no articulating of that vegetation. It was not sanctified by literature or hallowed by that experience. But the people of my generation who were beginning to write about it, who hesitated on the fringe of writing down the word breadfruit, on the fringe of writing down the word mango, didn't mean that the mango was not a beautiful tree. It was that the penalty of colonialism was the mango couldn't possibly have the dignity of an oak, in the same way that a black West Indian could not have possibly have the dignity of an Englishman in Warwickshire. That's the penalty of colonialism.
This is the mango tree. And that one there is the sweet stuff. We eat it when it's ripe, we eat it. We pick it, we sell it, we make juice with it. All different kinds of things. And this one there, the nuts, we roast them and we peel them up and we eat them. Sometimes we can even make juice with it, and we eat it, we drink it. The coconut, when it's dry, we make coconut balls, we make coconut oil, we make all different kinds of things.
We always spoke two languages. It wasn't like I had to struggle to understand English. I mean, English was the language at home of all the college boys, except those who were very much poorer maybe and came from the country in which they might purely have been speaking French Creole. But it's a dual sharing. I mean, the experience, all the other language certainly in the towns, was English. All right. Now maybe that English is of course a broken English, so you have two dialects. You have a French-English dialect, right, deriving from both English and French. You have a patois dialect deriving from French, So you really, if you look at it, you've got 3 or 4 going to draw from, But in terms of, it's not a matter of my feeling, in any way it's different from, my college experience, my Methodist school experience, that we were taught, in English. And in fact, as a matter of fact, Creole would not have been used in the classrooms at all. It wasn't that it was punished like happened to the English, the Welsh language, or the Irish language. And of course, there was a sort of social scourge attached to it, but not in my house, not for my mother, I mean, because, and you heard that sound around you. It was wonderful to hear it, It's still great to hear it.
Bicyclette la plus vite passe en manille. Ou descendre bicyclette là en 3 bons cons matou. Ou courir bon matou dans la mémoire de revenu. Ou raconter en fond mille fois le qui va savoir qu'il faut y aller. Zandolé. C'est pas comme ça, Zandolé qui a marché. Ça y fait où? Ça y fait où? Eh ben. C'est où maman Bouya mettait des voyeurs au soir. D'avou dans 30 balles, à 100 mots l'invitation. Elles sont gratifiées là-dessus, elles sont chiens couillés dehors, elles sont chaque saut d'assaut.
How much are these Palry mangoes?
Yes.
How much are they? $1, you have change for 10? Pomme arak, Otahiti apple, pomme sitaire, pomme granite, moube, zanana, the pineapple's Aztec helmet. Pomme, I have forgotten what pomme for the Irish potato. Cerise, the cherry, zamon, sea almonds, where the crisp sea bursts, au bord de la rivière. Come back to me, my language. Come back, Kako, Gris-Gris, Solitaire, Ciseaux, the scissor bird. No nightingales except once in the indigo mountains of Jamaica. Blue depth deep as coffee, flicker of pimento, the shaft light on a yellow ackee, the bark alone bare. Jardin en montagne, en habitation, the wet leather reek of the hill donkey.
Papa, tout le temps, oui, tonton, oui, bon, ça va maintenant, tout le monde te laisse. Les grands frères, oui, papa, oui, cousin, oui, tonton, oui, bon, ça va maintenant, tout te laisse. Là, oui, oui, belle, dit madame, moi. Je t'ai raché en tout roche là, qui t'est caché, c'est vrai, après 2 heures, gros gourmet, et puis gros andoli cacoa, vaillant qu'on bœuf, c'est dit. Les grands frères, oui, papa, oui, cousin, oui, tonton, oui, bon, ça va maintenant, tout te laisse. Ni chez qui mille fourmis mordantes et capouilles en varé, assointis sous chilette blanc, antis chilette Zandoli. Eh ben.
So if I stood on the coast of St. Lucia and, the villages are below, the salt wind is blowing and you can hear the noise of the trees behind you and then the noise in the village behind you. What you go through is like a surging, it's like a lifting. You feel so small that you feel so incapable of making the pages rustle if they could, like the wind, or making the light come off the page as if it were light on a wall. You just want to do that because it's such a celebration to do it, to convey it to someone else. I mean, I would say that's practically all my life has meant, really, to be able to do that, I think.
Well, we use Bradaman, we use they call it Poi and Balata. Bois rouge, you get in red cedar, you get in blue maho, get in white pine, what again? They have teak, acajou, they have akukwa, you get in all them woods, the furniture. They have only called in Guape Mao.
A panel of sunrise on a hillside shop gave these stanzas their stilted shape. If my craft is blessed, if this hand is as accurate, as honest as their carpenters, every frame intent on its angles would echo the settlement of unpainted wood. As consonants scroll off my shaving plane in the fragrant creole of their native grain, from a trestle bench they'd curl at my foot, C's, R's with a French or West African root. From a dialect thronging its leaves, unread yet light on the tongue of their native road. But drawing towards my pegged out twine with beveled boards of unpainted pine, like muttering shale, exhaling trees refresh memory with their smell. Boiscano, Boiscampeche, hissing, what you wish from us will never be. Your words is English, is a different tree.
Tout corps c'est corps, corps roche, corps bois, corps de l'eau, non. Tout corps c'est corps, mais c'est l'esprit corps qui met corps. Ouah, l'esprit en fil bouillot, ou cadavre corps, pas chalet ou aller en chemin des quartiers, vieillesse mal dégagé. Où trouver la vie en gorge, la vie t'est là, pas t'es ni en haut, ni en bas, ni là, ni dans, ou tout, pas d'air, ou pas devant. Il prend, oui, mettez dalle, pas gâter en pied, ou avec un crasse, lumière des yeux. Et puis bon, on va l'empouper, ça a l'air sous ton Dieu, grâce au doigt. Ouah, porter tout ça qui compasse au respect. Et puis virer la vie, tout ça, ou la poubelle. Tout corps, c'est corps, corps roche, corps bois, corps de l'eau, non. Tout corps, c'est corps. Mais c'est l'esprit corps qui met corps.
There are different candles and customs here. The dead are different. Different shells guard their graves. There are distinctions beyond the paradise of our horizon. This is not the grape purple Aegean. There is no wine here, no cheese. The almonds are green, the sea grapes bitter. The language is that of slaves. I've never tried to just paint it in the sort of postcard way or some, phony pastoral vision because, the poverty was too strong, the disease around you and so on, and, the smell of the drains and so on. I've never tried to leave that out, or the struggle or the poverty and so on. So I've never just tried to paint a kind of, Whitman-esque pastoral of some huge dream and so on.
What do you have to say about the Caribbean as a place of corruption, inertia, a place to wring your hands over, as V.S. Naipaul does? You satirize him in a poem called Spoiler's Return as V.S. Nightfall.
Yes.
What about that point of view?
I don't have that sense of despair. How much lower can you go than slavery, So unless you can find something that is, worse than slavery, which is hard to imagine, because slavery is a nameless, anonymous, hopeless condition, which you're deprived of everything, your name, your family, your country. That is not so in the Caribbean. Quite the opposite is happening. I think a claiming is happening that is there in the younger writers. They're not bothered now about whether they should go to London or whether they should recognize as X or Y by, some metropolitan authority. Quite the opposite is happening. You can't use the same terms to apply to, someone in Athens or in the Middle East as you would to the Caribbean, simply because the history does not have those references. But you see, that I think is also the strength of the Caribbean, that physically even, if a slave had to cross in the whole of the Atlantic and stand up, after thousands of miles on a beach, that's a very strong specimen of an African. And that is true mentally, spiritually. The effort required to let your land go back behind you and to start again does not make the Caribbean races, groups of degraded people. It makes them extremely strong. It makes them physically strong. Otherwise, those who are sick were at the bottom of the ocean.
Before he went back to St. Lucia for the summer, Derek Walcott began working on a new novel-length poem which looks at the Homeric myth of Hector and Achilles in terms of the lives of a group of modern St. Lucian fishermen.
Well, right now I'm working on something that's tentatively titled either Homeros or Omeros, which is a Greek name for Homer. But part of it, I think, came from the idea that when you anglicize something, you lose a lot. Homer and Virgil sound like two New England farmers, And I knew this Greek girl who laughed when I said the name Homer, and she said, that's not his name. And I think the whole part of it is that's not his name. It's part of the theme of the thing. And one of the characters in it is a man called Achille, which, of course, that's not his name, because he's an African, a St. Lucian fisherman. And although I don't deal with what his original name must have been, I think thematically it is going to be that he is an Achilles, in a sense, that he is a warrior, except his arena is the sea.
Je suis allé fouiller à chercher gros bois, là moi j'ai un gros bois. Je suis fouillé. Avec moi j'ai mené des sons by monsieur Rossou puis en monté. Donc j'ai cherché bois, j'ai découlé avant mon pays.
This was how, in green sunrise, they chose the canoes. On a cold ridge, as the hazed sea was waking, they stood in dewy ferns. Now their gaze follows the mass of mossy trunks, the top leaves shaking in windy light like the noise of emerald shallows, with that identical noise. Also the slow creaking branches creaked like the screech of pulleys, so that the running hills, the fog-thinned valleys, were to these fishermen extensions of the sea's early sound. And they saw the wind agreeing with their rooted judgment, the axes in their eyes that had already hacked and trimmed the cedars. Columns are brought down, and towering cultures from the root, from the speckled blight at the base of Troy. The way those cedars slowly leaned towards the ferns with a long sideways groan, leaving a space for the new sky where no sky was before.
Well, là, M. Maxime fait comme moi, qui a fouillé, qui a préparé. Nous avons collé avec 20 hommes ici, nous avons pris un choc, nous avons monté un forest là, nous avons du choc là, nous avons pris un bois, nous avons monté un bois, nous avons marié, et puis nous avons pour nous, pour personne ne va la Bible ici, et puis nous avons descendu à midi, et puis la nuit, nous avons réduit bon chemin, nous avons bâti un bon choc, et puis nous avons mis un beau village là, oui, by M. Rossou.
All this whole business of crossing the world and coming to these small bits of, of an archipelago, in which some places are recreated, in a sense. I'm sure there must be, even in a legendary sense, a reflection of Africa, certainly in the details of a lot of things, quite apart from the language and the way of life and, certain courtesies and certain very simple things that are there. So that in a sense, this archipelago is in a way a mirror of the one on the other side. The inland sea and the rhythm of the sea, I think, particularly in small islands, even perhaps imperceptibly on a large island, has something to do with the interior rhythm of people. The activity of fishing becomes more than a simple activity. To me, in a way, it becomes something legendary. Hector was there. Theophile also. In this light, they have only single names: Placide, Bobot, Félix, Papanom, Maljo, Achille, and Patrocle. As they took up the spatulate lances of oars and set them parallel in the empty gunwales over the fresh bilge under the rowing planks, then returned together with this identical stride, except for Philoctet, who limped with a bad foot with the same incurable sore that he believed the sea salt would cure. They unhooked the nets that had grown sleepier with the dew, the lines of the nylon, bottle green, fading purple, as if a hand had stained them with a wine dye, then carried the nets groaning to the gunwales and piled them apart from the oars, then stood resting from the wet weight, while Philoctet soothed his infected shin, cawed like a coral where a backwash caught him with an anchor's hook. They passed round the white rum. It was time to work. Philoctet watched them. They spat. The sun spread on their faces, moving towards the canoes. There is an inevitability of narrative, I think, in any Caribbean writer, simply because our stories have not been told. Whatever the attitude, embittered or whatever, sentimental, whatever the reason may be. But I think that instinct for narrative has a lot, this may sound very, very silly, but I think it has a lot to do with space and the relationship to time. I think the undertaking of narrative has got to do with the rhythm of a people's living. I think if you lived in London and you undertook narrative poetry, it wouldn't go further down the block unless you understood perhaps you wanted to do something historical about historical England anyway. So that the idea of history and in terms of the location of space, where we are in terms of time and space, and the fact that utterance hasn't really happened, it's been happening recently in the Caribbean, not because we are inarticulate people, but simply because slaves weren't allowed to write novels, do you know what I mean, in their days, you know what I mean, and there weren't books, there still aren't, there are very few printeries and so on. And since slavery is just barely 150 years old, or indenture later even, it's very recent, and it's not at all startling that there should be an outburst of people wishing to tell their own, experiences autobiographically. There's a strong sense of autobiography in the West Indian novel, not from vanity, I think, simply because of some trying to understanding of some ethnic relationship, particularly to where people are. It's there in Naipaul, it's there in C.L.R. James and people like that. I write this on a horned island, to the sound of the morning surf of wind on a sea of grass, from a girl's mouth whispering like reeds in sand. These men become letters, figures circling a vase. Their limbs are shone with crushed, legendary oils. Their lives are taken down from museum shelves. Their praise is carried in the white clay of her voice, the way a shell carries the ocean as it exhales at the air's shell, not Homer, but Omeros. And I heard the hollowing moan not of high ships setting out with iron captains, but only the prose of abrupt fishermen as they rolled their canoes.
Vai partir par là. Ça va, ouais. Allô, c'est comme ça. Ouais. Bateau, mec. Allô. Tu ça bien? Ouais.
It's not that these islands are like very close to any mainland. There's an enormous width of sea between, say, Central America and, and Martinique. I mean, it's a vast area. It isn't something that's safe. I mean, they are going out into a huge element in which there have been, disasters.
Oh, et ça allait environ 40 lieues. On pas de compost à bord. Là, on peut dire terre, on va pas arrêter. On va se dépasser trop loin. Voilà, là, environ 40 lieues. Ni de là, on va aller aussi loin, il est en blanc, en sombre. On va aller aussi loin. Mais si tu es en clair, on va vivre environ 40 lieues.
I mean, I know who's in it. I almost have a shape of the first book. It's not modeled on the Odyssey or the Iliad. The names of the Africans who are given heroic names, sometimes in a servile sense, sometimes out of, patronage or out of admiration sometimes, whether somebody is called Pompey as a slave or someone is called Achille or someone is called Caesar or something. I don't think these names are purely names given contemptibly by, slave owners. I think the qualities in those slaves that the owner recognized and ascribed those qualities to the slave, so that an Achille, to me, it would be not a phenomenon if he were a very, whatever qualities Achilles had or Hector would have. Mark Hillman had the oldest rum shop in the village. It had an old upstairs balcony. 10 yards from it, Hector fell, staring past its wooden tables. Then he roared in the footsteps of sulking Achilles, baiting his shadow until it entered the leopard shade of an old almond and sat in his legendary rage beyond noon, watching the sand widen from the sea's withdrawal. Surf fingers smoothed out the page where their names were written. If Achille came forward and fell for the hectoring, Crapon, vieux nègre, coward. If Achille sharpened a cutlass for Hector's head. For a while near the nets, the villagers gathered, then left a bent shadow under the almond to read the fate it sketched in sand. And then Achille stood. Then Hector came back, and this time Hector had more than a stone. And why these men quarreled until one of their trunks branched into blood, nobody remembers, but all said they understood. There are many who claim the same for the Iliad. Well, I think the biggest problem for me, it always remain, is how honest I am, not in terms of my own feeling, but whether I magnify something into a kind of glory that it does not deserve. And I'm here again for 2 days, and I've been bothered about it. And this morning when I was swimming, I thought, Okay, this is fine. If I went further in to the sea, and really went into the sea, and if I got aboard a canoe and was going out, and the island receded till there was nothing but a little, hump on the horizon, I would be in the center of an immensity that is bound to bring some kind of awe. I have only one theme. The bowsprit, the arrow, the longing, the lunging heart. The flight to a target whose aim we'll never know. Vain search for one island that heals with its harbor and a guiltless horizon, where the almond shadow doesn't injure the sand. There are so many islands, as many islands as the stars at night. Sometimes it's just me in the soft scissored foam as the deck turn white, and the moon open a cloud like a door, and the light over me is a road in white moonlight taking me home. Shabin sang to you from the depths of the sea.
La vie en gorge. La vie t'est là, pas t'es ni en haut, ni en bas, ni là, ni dans, en tout, pas d'air, pas de vent. Et prend, oui, mettez dalle, pas gâter en pied, ouais, comme crasse, ni en dédié. Et puis bon, on va l'empouper, ça a l'air sous le compte, brasse au doigt. On va apporter tout ça qui compasse au respect. Et puis virer la vie, tout ça, on la poubelle. Tout cause et corps, rouge, corps bois, corps de l'eau, non. Tout cause et corps. Mais c'est l'esprit corps qui met corps.